Okay, so today we're doing October-November 2021, question paper 11. 2 questions not relevant to syllabus. Question 15, canons of taxation, and question 25. Okay, so we start at question 30. Government wishes to increase aggregate demand. Which actions would be most likely to succeed? Okay, so reduction in income tax, yes, that would be expansionary fiscal, but increasing interest rates would move AD left. That would be contractionary monetary policy. So that wouldn't, they'd counteract each other. Reducing income tax, expansionary fiscal, increasing production subsidies. Yeah, that would help to move AD to the right. Increasing production subsidies would help to increase demand on the domestic market. Reducing income tax would provide more consumer expenditure and more investment maybe into the economy as well. Increasing corporation tax is contractionary fiscal, so that wouldn't work. And increasing sales tax or indirect taxes would do the same. It would decrease consumer expenditure, so both of them would move AD to the left and would therefore not help to increase AD. Question 29. Balance of payments on the current account for Guatemala. So it was a deficit previously, and in 2016 it had moved into a surplus. Okay, so very simply, in simple terms, what we could expect to have happened is that their exports had risen and their imports had decreased. So we'll keep that in mind when we look at the questions. An appreciation of their currency would not help them to move from a surplus to a surplus from a deficit, because it would actually increase a deficit. Price of imports would drop and the total imports would rise, which goes against what we have here, which we know imports should have decreased and exports should have risen. If it was a devaluation or depreciation of the currency, that would have been a contributing factor. A growth of household incomes to the same effect would actually result in an increase in imports, as people would have more money to spend from importing goods and services from another country. A lowering of tariffs would have the exact same effect. It would increase the number of imports that come into the economy, so it would be the opposite effect of what we're looking for. And then productivity improvements in Guatemala's export sector, that would be what we're looking for. That would help Guatemala's exports to increase if they're able to be more productive in their production of them. And assuming imports would stay the same, then we would be able to create a balance of payment surplus. Okay, question 28. A government reduces the rate of direct tax, so that is expansionary fiscal. Expansionary fiscal policy, and they devalue their currency, so price of exports go down, total exports go up, price of imports go up, and total imports go down. That would be an expansionary monetary policy. So fiscal expansionary, expansionary monetary as well, and at the same time it would also be an expansionary supply side policy, because reducing the rate of direct tax would incentivize more workers to come into the economy, and it may result in the labor force increasing. LF, not LB. Labor force may increase, which may allow us to move our aggregate supply to the right. Okay, question 27. Which changes are most likely to reduce the accuracy of the CPI? Okay, a larger sample would actually help to increase the accuracy because it would reduce the sampling errors that would occur. Technology makes it easier for retailers to submit accurate data. That would obviously help us to increase our CPI accuracy as well if the data is more accurate. Households change their spending patterns, so that would be the correct answer here. If they change their spending patterns, the accuracy would be reduced because we would have difficulty reflecting the change in their spending patterns. In order to reflect the change in their spending patterns, we would have to adapt the weightings that are in the basket of goods and services, and therefore D would also help us to increase the accuracy of the CPI figure. Question 26, what is the most likely cause of cost push inflation? So remember, cost push inflation is where aggregate supply moves to the left. Increase in the exchange rate would move AD left, just like we explained in the previous question, either 29 or 30, the effect of an appreciation. Increase in the money supply is an expansionary monetary policy. It would move AD right. So it might affect demand pull inflation, but it won't affect cost push inflation. Increase in the price of imports, however, would, because what we would have to do is importing raw materials would become more expensive. Importing raw materials becomes more expensive. What that does is it makes the cost of production for domestic companies go up, and then that would cause aggregate supply to move to the left, which would equal cost push inflation generating. And finally, if we have an increase in the rate of income tax, that is a contractionary fiscal policy. It's designed to decrease consumer expenditure, so aggregate demand would shift left, and it would help to reduce demand pull inflation, but would definitely not cause cost push inflation. So question 24, an economy experiences a deficit on the current account of its balance of payments. What can the economy do to finance the deficit? Okay, so remember, we're not trying to fix the deficit, essentially, we're trying to finance this deficit. So how are we going to attract funds, essentially? If we adopt a fixed exchange rate, that's not going to have any bearing on financing the deficit. But if we attract more foreign direct investment, that obviously will. It will help us to finance that deficit by attracting the multinational companies into the country. Decreasing income tax rates and lowering the rate of interest would similarly not have an effect in financing the deficit. We would need to attract FDI or multinational companies to come into the country. That would attract an inflow of investment from abroad, and that would help us to finance the deficit that has occurred. Okay, simple, straightforward question if you read it carefully about financing the deficit instead of directly addressing it. Okay, absolute and comparative advantage question. So remember, comparative advantage is actually the only one that's mentioned here. That is the lower opportunity cost. So all we have to do is calculate the opportunity cost for each. So for country X, we'll do it first. For country X, the opportunity cost of producing one rice is 0.6 or 0.67 tables. The opportunity cost of producing one table is 1.5 rice. For country Y, opportunity cost of producing one rice is 0.5 tables. and the opportunity cost of producing 1 table is 2 rice. Okay, so on the theory of comparative advantage, they should specialize in what they have the lowest opportunity cost in. That would be rice for country Y, and it would be tables for country X, as we can see here. So country X has a comparative advantage in both. We can see that's wrong. Country X has a comparative advantage in rice. We can also see in that case here that that's wrong. Country Y does not have an advantage in both, but country Y does have an advantage in rice, as we can see here from what we calculated under our theory of comparative advantage. Okay, a developed country has price inelastic demand for oil, all of which it imports. The oil producing country increases the supply of oil. Okay, so very importantly, if the supply of oil increases, then the price of oil will drop, right? Now, because they've got price inelastic demand, what that's going to mean is that the quantity demanded, or the increase in quantity demand, will actually change by less than the change in price, right? So our total expenditure on imports will actually drop, but we will be receiving the imports we bring in cheaper. So what that's going to do is it's actually going to lower, because we import all of the oil, and oil is it's a commodity that will affect aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It will actually lower the cost of production for those businesses because they're able to receive it cheaper. So because it lowers the cost of production, what it may actually allow us to do is it may allow us to move our aggregate supply curve to the right, which will actually decrease our rate of inflation and won't increase it. Okay, now if we decrease our rate of inflation, because we know the total expenditure on imports will go down, our balance of trade therefore should improve, as our exports will stay the same, our imports will drop, and we'll now have more export revenue relative to import expenditure. Okay, terms of trade definition question. Very simple. It is the index of export prices divided by the index of import prices. That is what the terms of trade measures. So it is nothing to do with the volume of exports and imports. Average price of its exports divided by average price of imports. That's correct. It's nothing to do with total value or total volume. It is very simply, just like we said there, index of the prices or the average prices of both. Okay, question 20. What is disinflation? So again, just another simple definition question. Disinflation is where the rate of inflation, right? So the rate of inflation is still positive. In other words, we still have inflation, but it is going at a decreasing rate. Right? So for example, if in year 1 we have inflation of, let's say, 3%, and in year 2 we have inflation of 2%, that would be disinflation in year 2. Because in year 2 here we still have an increase in the price level, but it's going at a decreasing rate from what it did previously, which was 3% in year 1 to now being 2%. So therefore it is a fall in the rate of increase of the price level. Nothing to do with output. Doesn't necessarily mean a fall in price level. Doesn't mean a fall in the value of national income. Remember, disinflation is positive, so it's always a plus figure, but it's just going at a decreasing rate. Inflation is always positive and it is increasing at an increasing rate. And then deflation is where we would have a negative change, so the figure would be negative. Okay, question 19. Government plans to increase spending on education and training every year. What's the effect in their long run output and price level? Okay, so government spending would be a component of aggregate demand. So that would mean that aggregate demand has to move to the right. But in the long run, so we'll just say LR here, government spending on education and training should be able to increase our productive capacity. So what we would also expect is, because they're spending on it every year, in the long run we should also see a shift in the aggregate supply curve to the right as our economy becomes more productive and as our workers become more productive. So therefore, if we just match it up to what we know should happen, the only diagram that shows a rightward shift in AD here and a rightward shift in LRAS over the long run is C. Okay, question 18. An effective minimum price is applied to alcohol in an attempt to reduce consumption. Why would a government not buy any of the surplus created? Okay, very simple. So buying the surplus would lead to unemployment. That is not true. Buying the surplus would help to keep people in their jobs, as the governments would essentially be giving more revenue to the producers. Buying the surplus would lead to a shortage. No, a minimum price creates a surplus, remember, it doesn't create a shortage. It's placed above the equilibrium price. It's placed up here when you have demand and supply. An effective minimum price has to be above the equilibrium. So it's an extension of supply and it's a contraction in demand, and that is what creates the surplus in here. Buying the surplus would decrease the incomes of producers. Absolutely not. They'd be receiving the income from the government buying the surplus, but a reason why they would not buy it is because it's costly for the government. Question 17. What would be the main effect of imposing an effective maximum price on foodstuffs? So remember, for it to be an effective maximum price, it's kind of like the opposite of what we had in the previous question for 18. For it to be an effective maximum price, it would have to be imposed below the equilibrium price. So here in this market, we would have our equilibrium denoted here by P and Q. And then our max price, we'll just label M, would have to be placed somewhere underneath that equilibrium to create this shortage that would take effect, right? So Q1 to Q2 that we're going to denote on the diagram here, that would represent the shortage that's created, right? So inflation would rise? Definitely not. We're reducing the price of basic foodstuff. Price of foodstuff would rise? Definitely not. Effective maximum price has to be below equilibrium, so price would drop. There would be a decrease in the import of foodstuff. Not necessarily true. Remember that what it creates is a shortage, which is excess demand, right? So if these consumers cannot actually get the foodstuff, they may still have to import either through the black market or just import from other countries and pay a higher price, especially if, because of the contraction in supply, that they can't actually receive the good or find enough of it to be sold. But what it definitely would do, just like we have over here on the right hand side, is it would create a shortage of foodstuffs. From the extension in demand, it would create excess demand. Okay, question 16. A government decides to remove fees for higher education provided by public sector and private sector. What is the consequence of this policy? Okay, simple. This would be A. Higher education is less likely to be provided by private sector. Why is that? Private sector, remember, is incentivized by profit. So if the government is removing higher fees and they're capping the fees that can be charged in the private sector, then essentially they're reducing the profit that the private sector can obtain. So higher education is definitely going to be less likely to be provided. Resources in higher education will be allocated through the price mechanism. No, that's not a consequence. We're told here it's provided by the public sector as well. Demand for higher education will be perfectly elastic when the price is zero. Not necessarily true. One thing we remember about education is that it's a merit good. It generates external benefits. So we know that it's actually underconsumed and underproduced. An opportunity cost of higher education to students will be zero. That's definitely not going to apply if they remove the higher fees either. Still going to be an opportunity cost of education in terms of the leisure time they're giving up for their study and in terms of other activities that they could be doing with their time. It's only the fees that have been removed. Okay, question 14. What is an example of privatization? Remember, privatization is moving from government owned to the private sector. It's the opposite of nationalization. So if there's a purchase of a Swedish pharmaceutical producer by a larger American, that would be in the private sector, right? So that would not be moving from government to private. That would be going from private to private. Takeover of a French car manufacturer by a national French government. That would be nationalization, which is the opposite, moving from private into public. Sale of a privately owned water company to a German firm, that's the same as D. That would be private to private. Sale on the market of a French state-owned power generation company, that would be our correct answer. It is state-owned or it is government-owned as of right now, and they're selling it on the market to the private sector. Okay, diagram shows how a 10% increase in consumer incomes shifts the demand for good X from D to D1. What statement about good X is correct? So first of all, we can see that the demand curve has moved to the left. If consumer incomes have gone up, we need to remember that there's normal goods and there's inferior goods, right? Normal goods have a positive relationship, which means that if income goes up, then demand will also go up. Whereas for inferior goods, they have an inverse relationship with income. So as income goes up, the demand for inferior goods will actually come down. So that tells us straight away that in this diagram, we are looking at an inferior good. Now we just have to remember our formula for YED in order to calculate whether it's elastic or inelastic. So we can see that the income has gone up by 10%. We can see the quantity here has decreased by 20%, right? So quantity demanded down by 20%. Income up by 10%. And now if you remember your formula is the percentage change in quantity demanded over the percentage change in income. So if you put that over that, you get 2.0 negative because it's inferior good. And that tells us that it is income elastic demand because it is greater than 1. Okay, question 12. Diagram shows demand curve and supply curve for a good on which the government imposes a specific tax. What will be the result of this? Okay, so straight away we can see the answer is going to be A, and I'll tell you why. As soon as you see the supply curve is more inelastic than the demand curve, the incidence of a specific tax will always therefore fall heavily on the producer. And in fact, when the supply curve is perfectly inelastic, all of the incidence of the tax will fall on the producer. So even if we draw a diagram here to show that, for example, we'll draw one, let's say here, okay? So we know a specific indirect tax will move the supply curve to the left. Now, to find the incidence of the tax, we need to take the new supply curve and we need to bring it down to where it hits the original supply. We'll just say it's here, for example, and then we need to bring it straight across, right? So the incidence of the total area of the tax would be this red area here that you're following my pen with. And that's how we calculate the incidence of the tax. The area that the producer would face the burden of is this large area in here, and the area that the consumer would face the burden of is always just the difference between the price they were paying and the price they are now paying. So the more elastic the demand, the smaller the change in price will be. And therefore, if there's a smaller change in price, the burden that the consumer faces is much less, because the producer can't change the price by as much. That means that the producer essentially has to absorb all this incidence of the specific tax into their cost of production, and it's going to significantly decrease their profits. Okay, question 11. Demand for a good increases. Under which circumstances will the quantity supplied of the good rise the most? Okay, so demand increases, we're looking for when will the extension in supply be the greatest? So it's an agricultural good that has an annual growing cycle. That is not going to help their PES be elastic. Essentially, that's what we're looking for, right? We're looking for a PES to be elastic because we want them to be responsive to the changes in demand. Now, if they are or have an annual growing cycle and require a cool climate, that is not going to help them be elastic because they can only change it once a year. If they are perishable and it's very expensive to store, that is another determinant of PES, and that will also make them highly inelastic, not elastic. A manufactured good that uses unskilled labour and there is unemployment in the economy, that will help them to be elastic. They use unskilled labour, it's cheap. If there's unemployment in the economy, that unskilled labour, they will be very willing and able to accept a job at the going wage rate, and that will allow them to increase their labour quickly, and therefore to be able to produce more products quickly. And if they use capital intensive production and they're at full capacity, what they need to do is they need to increase their capacity before they can make their PES more elastic, and that will only take place over the long term by being able to increase their capital equipment or maybe increase the size of the building that they're operating in. Okay, diagram shows demand curve and supply curves for a good in a free market. What can definitely be deduced from the diagram? All the costs and benefits of consumption are reflected in OP1. Okay, we can't conclude that from the diagram. We're told here that it's in the free market, right? Now remember that in a free market it's provided by the private sector. So all they consider is the private benefits and the private costs, right? Which are essentially their own firms' benefits of the profit they will make from the selling price, plus the costs that it costs to make the product, and they don't consider the external benefit or external cost. So therefore, the socially optimum level is not reflected at OP1, it is just the private benefit and the private cost of the firm. At OP1, consumer expenditure is greater than the firm's revenue. No, that's not going to be the case. At OP1, their expenditure will equal to their revenue because that's the selling price of the product. So what they sell for and here at equilibrium will be the revenue that the firm receives, and it will also be the expenditure that the consumer spends. At OP1, PES is equal to 1, That is true. How do we know? Remember that unitary PES always comes out of the point of origin. As soon as we see a supply curve that is straight line, like this one is, it's in a straight line here all the way up here. As soon as it comes out of the point of origin, it has a unitary PES, which means that at every point along that curve, it is equal to 1.00. And finally, the market will not clear at a price of OP1. That's incorrect. We can see that the market has cleared at a price of OP1. Clearing meaning that demand is equal to supply. And that's exactly what we can see in this diagram. Demand equals supply at a price of OP1. Okay, difficult question, this one. This paper is quite difficult, I think, actually. So, which statement about price elasticity of the curves is correct? Curve 1 has constant infinite elasticity. That's incorrect. Curve 1 has constant zero elasticity because it is perfectly inelastic. Remember, perfectly inelastic means that the PES value will always be 0, and that is because of our formula for PES, which is the percentage change in quantity supplied divided by the percentage change in price, and the quantity supplied cannot change if it's perfectly inelastic. Curve 2 has elasticity greater than curve 4 over its whole length. That is incorrect. So this is to do with the theory of I call it the theory of a linear supply curve, because a linear demand curve, you know how the elasticity is changed. It's essentially the same thing here, right? So very simply, if we put in a price point here, let's say this is the price, and we take it to where it intersects curve 4, and we take it to where it intersects curve 2. Alright, we can see that this will be curve 4 here, and this will be curve 2. And the theory is very simple. The further we are to the left in the quantity, then therefore any change in the price is going to result in a greater percentage change in the quantity. So that would therefore mean that because 2 is further along to the right, the number of the quantity would be bigger, and therefore any change in price would result in a smaller percentage change in the quantity. So therefore curve 4 actually has a greater elasticity because it is further to the left in terms of the quantity, which means that any change would have a greater percentage change in its quantity supplied. Curve 3 has increasing elasticity. That's false. We just explained that in the last question. It comes out of the point of origin, so its elasticity will be 1.00, unitary at any point along the curve. Curve 4 has decreasing elasticity as price rises. That's true, and how do we know? As we said here, with the price that goes up, the further we go up with the price, if we take a price point up here, the further we're moving to the right here, which means that the quantity will be dealing with a larger number. And if the quantity is dealing with a larger number, then it will result in a smaller percentage change in quantity. Which will make it more inelastic. Okay, question 8. Table shows maximum price a consumer would be willing to pay for successive cans of fruit juice. The price of a can of fruit juice is $4, and having bought 3 cans, the consumer decides to buy a 4th. How does buying the 4th affect his consumer surplus? Okay, so price of a can is $4. Remember, the consumer surplus is the difference between the price he is willing to pay and the price he actually pays, right? So therefore, let's calculate his consumer surplus to show us. The price is $4, but he is willing to pay $14 for the first one. So when he purchases the first one, the size of his consumer surplus is $10. Plus, therefore, $6 when he purchases the second one. Plus $2 when he purchases the third one, because he's still willing to pay $6, but he's only paying $4. And then when he purchases the fourth one, he doesn't get any consumer surplus, because that's the maximum he's willing to pay for the fourth can. So therefore, it will leave his consumer surplus unchanged. His consumer surplus will stay at $18 in total when he buys the fourth one. And in fact, his surplus will actually decrease if he buys the fifth one, because it will go down by $1. Okay, definition question for XED. Simple, just know your formula. It is a change in the demand for a good in response to a change in the price of a complement. Remember that it is the percentage change in quantity demanded of good A divided by the percentage change in price of good B. Therefore, demand has to go on top. So B will be our correct answer. Okay, when the supply of a good decreases, equilibrium price stays the same. What is the price elasticity of demand for the good? Okay, so if the equilibrium price never changes, that tells us that it has to look something like this, right? So it's going to be perfectly elastic, right? Because here the price can't change, but the quantity can. When it is perfectly elastic, if you know from your theories of PED, that equals infinity as the PED value. Perfectly inelastic, PED value 0. Perfectly elastic, PED value infinity. Because price will never change, but demand can change rapidly. Okay, question 5. Supply curve for fresh fish shifts from S1 to S2 is shown. What is a possible reason for this change in the supply of fresh fish? Okay, simple. We're just looking for a reason why the supply of fish could have been reduced. So it's nothing to do with demand, it's to do with supply, right? So A is out of the question. Favourable weather increases the quantity of fish being caught. Supply would shift to the right, it would not shift to the left. Price of fresh fish falls due to a new substitute product becoming popular. Again, that would not cause a shift to the left. Regulations limiting the number of fish being caught to prevent overfishing, however, would restrict the supply level of fish. It would restrict how much we can actually catch. Okay, so unusual to see this kind of question so early in an exam paper. If it's under the new syllabus, any of these types of questions will come probably around 23, 24, that kind of range. But what can be concluded from the diagram? So this is it's a trading possibility curve diagram. Okay, now straight away we can see that point OR shows us the total combination that is possible. So the output that can be achieved, right? If they specialize in drink or in food, based on whatever they have the advantage in, and therefore if they engage in international trade at an opportunity cost that lies between their comparative advantages. So that would be the correct answer. Now if we look at all points on y1 to x2 are only attainable through trade, that is not true. They can attain those points themselves, right, as shown in the PPCs here. Point P represents final equilibrium outcome. No, point P just represents an intersection here, but these are different countries, right? So it just means that y1 to x1, this is how much of the drink they can make, this is how much of the food they can make with their current set of resources. Point P is just showing the fact there is no equilibrium outcome when it comes to a trading possibility curve or a PPC curve, right? Remember, that's not what they're designed to show. And for A, they face increasing opportunity costs. That's not true. Remember, increasing opportunity costs would be if the PPC was curved, like so. Good A here and good B. That would represent increasing opportunity costs. Okay, question 3. Table provides information on entrepreneurship amongst males in 3 countries in 2013. What can we conclude from the table? In Sweden, it's easier for male entrepreneurs to get training than finance. Sweden, 61% of males can get training, but only 49% can get finance, so that's true, right? It's always more difficult for male entrepreneurs to get finance than training. That's not true, because we can see in Japan that it's actually easier for them to get finance instead of training. Italy provides less money. We don't know that information. We only know the percentage of male entrepreneurs that can get access to either money or to finance. We don't know how much they're getting, and we don't know how many entrepreneurs they have either. Okay, question 2. Which statement about the behavior of firms in a planned economy is correct? Firms are sent signals to produce through the price mechanism. That's false. Remember, a planned economy is government controlled. So there is no workings of price mechanism. That's for the mixed or the market economy. Firms therefore do not operate in competitive markets because it's government controlled. Firms do not attempt to make profits for the benefit of stakeholders or shareholders, but they do consider private and external costs of production because it is the government, and that is what they consider. So refer back to question, which question? Question 10, where we talked about in the free market only private benefits and private costs are considered. But in a planned economic system, because it's essentially the government's role, or it's the government's aim, in order to increase access for society and to ensure their citizens have a good standard of living, they will consider the external benefits and external costs, and they'll either reduce their production of goods that have an external cost or not make them at all, or they will increase their production of goods that generate external benefits. Okay, final question. European airline opens a new route to Dubai. It purchases additional aeroplanes, rents additional landing slots, hires pilots and buys back some of its shares to raise the value of the firm on the stock market. What is an example of the factor of production capital? That would be aeroplanes, right? So the landing slots is land, the pilots is labour, and the shares would represent enterprise or ownership. Capital would be the equipment or the machinery, which would be the aeroplanes that they need to operate. Okay, and that's October-November 2021 question paper 11 solved.